If you could have convincing texture, it'll add to the overall realism. Texture. That's right. Texture. I'm currently working on this painting right here of a moped. And even though it's small, it's quite troublesome. It is full of a lot of details, including a variation of different textures. But in today's video, I'm going to focus on how I did the tree right here. Hello and welcome. My name's Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I will show you how I created the bark texture on this tree right here. It was actually quite easy and not that difficult, just requires some patience. And with that said, let's take a look at the photo real quickly first. This right here is the photo I'm using. The main star is obviously the moped, but there's quite a lot of other things I had to deal with in this painting. For example, the reflective glass, the tile on the ground, and some detailed grass too. And I have yet to get to the moped. But one of the more interesting things I did is the tree. Not because of the bark, but because you really do not see the leaves on it, except for in the reflection of this storefront in the photo. Here's a little more close-up of the actual tree trunk texture. One thing I want to point out is that I made the sunlight more brighter. Well, I kind of wanted to boost the contrast to make it stand out more. Anyways, before I even started to paint the actual tree, I did an underpainting first. In this underpainting, I kind of mapped out where everything is. And the tree was just simply two solid bodies of color that represented the light side and the dark side. That's all. Why do you ask? It is just the underpainting after all, and I was just laying out where it was going to be in the composition. And on top of that, I didn't even start painting the tree until I got done the background first. And all those reflections, plus the lettering, made it quite a complex task to do. And it's very important that you choose your layering correctly, and usually working from the back to the front is usually the ideal way to go, which is why I didn't work on the moped yet. Another thing I want to point out about doing the tree, there's lots of variations in the texture. So my recommendation is pay attention to your reference photo and try to mimic those variations as best as you can. It will make the tree bark more believable. Anyway, enough talking. Let's get to the demonstration, shall we? I move on to painting the tree after I finished the background. But before I start detailing the bark, I first reshape the tree. The goal is in a way to create a border that separates the tree from the background. I keep it simple with lights and darks first. That way I can establish the direction of the sunlight. During the process, I'm trying to paint also some imperfections. The sides of a tree are not straight lines. There are bumps sometimes, small and large. And usually the trunk is thicker towards the bottom. And lastly, there is bark texture on the side too. More on that later. While painting the sides of the tree, there are times when I have to touch up the background as well. But the other reason is to help establish that the tree is not a cutout, but an actual cylinder that has volume and takes up space. And one way to do that is to give it a nice soft edge, particularly on the darker side. So after applying some red, I use a dry brush and gently blur the side of the tree where it meets the background. While doing this, I'm keeping in mind that the tree has bark texture, and also it's very close to the viewer. The other trees in the distance, well, that's a different story, so I can't go too crazy softening the side of the tree. Now it is time to start building the texture, and it is truly some tedious fun. I start with the side of the trunk that has direct sunlight by using a very thin liner brush to lay out some lines that will eventually create the illusion of bark. One very important thing I want to point out is that I'm not copying the photo 100%, but instead I'm using it as a reference and guide to create the illusion of bark texture. There are some distinguishable features that I did copy, but for the most part, I'm using it as a reference. Creating bark is not that difficult, but it will require painting a series of lines, both lights and darks, as well as brush strokes of different lengths and widths. Another thing to point out is the difference in contrast. It is definitely more extreme on the side of the trunk that the sunlight is hidden. That is why I'm using a combination of my brightest and darkest tones. They are definitely not pure white, or black for that matter, but for sure, I am barely using any middle tones, if any. And it makes sense, especially when you're trying to recreate the illusion of sunlight. And for the most part, I'm using very sharp brush work. That way the texture of the bark stands out. Now as for the side of the trunk that's in the shade, I'm going to approach it a lot more different. I will still create a lot of line work that will mimic bark, but the key differences will be less contrast and the line work won't be as sharp. I will use a dry brush to make it more blurry. In a way, the differences between the light side and the dark side will almost be literally like night and day. Speaking of dry brushing, that doesn't mean I didn't dry brush on the side of the tree where the sun is hitting it. I just did it very gently instead, especially for the first layer of oil. Plus, I didn't just use one dark tone to do all the texture in the sunlight. I did use also some middle tones too. The bark is getting hit by sunlight in different ways. It has to do with the grooves of the bark. Some are deeper than others, and some are also wider. Variation is the key to mimic realistic bark texture. Later, of course, I will revisit this section and add even more detail, but I do need the paint to be dry for that. Anyways, one of the most important areas to detail very carefully is where the light meets the dark on the tree. The trunk is round after all and not just a cutout, and on top of that, the surface is bumpy. So as you apply the brush strokes to create the texture for the bark, you have to integrate some of the light into the dark and some of the dark into the light. As I'm doing it, I'm trying to pay attention to the photo, once again not to copy it, but to mimic the transition of the texture from the sunlight to the shade. Towards the end when the paint is dry, I will revisit this section again in order to better fine-tune the transition. Anyhow, as I'm working the bark texture, I'm starting to focus more on variation, such as bigger and smaller pieces of bark, as well as the gaps between the bark as well. Also, if necessary, don't be afraid to use bigger brushes to apply the paint. Yes, I'm trying to do little detail, but it's always a good idea to block out areas and not just completely cover the whole tree with bark. Trees do have variation in their bark, so to make your texture more believable, you have to do the same as well. Once again, look at your photo for reference and try to mimic it as best as you can. Another technique I'm doing is that I'm crisscrossing some of the line work. Instead of doing straight lines, I'm doing some that are diagonal, and in the process, cutting through the lines that I already painted. Why? To create tinier pieces of bark. I'm doing this both in the sections in the light as well as the dark. Anyways, let's zoom up a little bit so you get a very up close look on how I create the bark texture. In order to get certain effects, sometimes you have to apply big brush strokes and then apply some line work in it. These here are some bigger bumps that are in the light section, so some of the texture will be actually in the shade. Even though this is the side the sun is hidden. To recreate these bumps, I'm applying my lights and darks first, then I'm painting lines within the lights and darks. Remember, things in the shade usually should have a softer touch and be more blurry versus things in the light. Now, as for the dark side, it's not going to be completely pitch black. There is reflective light from the area surrounding the tree. Light literally bounces from everything from the glass and even the ground. That is why it is important to show some detail on the dark side of the trunk. Very important, reflective light tends to be different colors. In the shade, they will have a cooler tone, but it all depends on the environment. For this, you definitely have to pay attention to your reference photo. In my scenario, it was light tones of purple. I'm going to speed up the footage now, but I will slow it down towards the end just to show you how I added the finished touches when the paint was dry. Anyhow, the best way to work the bark texture in the shade is while the oil paint is still wet, which is referred to as wet on wet. As mentioned before, details in the shade are not going to be as sharp. Working with wet oil paint has advantages and also disadvantages, but in this scenario, it is helpful painting soft, blurry texture, plus it's also easier to dry brush too. Just like painting the bark texture in the sunlight, the same applies also for the shade, where variation is the key to make it look believable. So definitely take a good look at your reference photo to not copy, but to mimic what you see, which will be bark in different sizes and shapes. Another thing I want to mention is that building the bark might require multiple layers, and in some ways, trial and error too. For example, I'm laying out lines of color, both lights and darks, dry brushing here and there, and then painting more lines of color, of different sizes and shapes of course, then dry brushing again. In some scenarios, I might have to block out an area, whether it's from an error that I made, or in some scenarios, minimize detail. And then when the paint dries, I go back into the same area to paint sharper detail where it is necessary. Now time to wrap up this demonstration by showing how I detail the final touches while the paint is dry. For the most part, I was painting the texture of the bark while the paint was wet, but it wouldn't allow me to get sharp details. Now that the paint is actually dry, I can focus on the final touches and not worry about muddy, diluted brushstrokes since the paint is no longer wet. This is the perfect time to also do the highlights. That way your extreme lights can be as bright as possible. Also, I mentioned earlier in the video about the transition between light and dark. There are some pieces of bark in the shade that stick out, therefore they catch some sunlight. When the paint is wet, it's more difficult to paint these highlights. This is also the perfect opportunity to paint some of the bark that sticks out on the sides. I might have worked on it earlier, but now it's time to fine tune it. That includes both sides of the trunk. That is why I waited towards the end. Besides some extreme lights, I also go for some extreme darks too. And my thought process during this whole time is make every brushstroke count, small or large, light or dark, and everything in between. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it, and hopefully you found this video very helpful. I try to keep it short and sweet. My ultimate goal is if you were to choose to do a painting with a tree in it, that you would not be intimidated by doing the bark, because it's not that hard, and the more you attempt something, the better you get. Anyhow, for more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. And check out my Etsy shop too. Links are in the description. Anyhow, I still have a little bit left to go in this painting, but hopefully I will get it done soon. So until next time, stay tuned for more. Bye for now.